All right, I guess it's that time, Bill.
Great. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm glad you're here. My name is Bill Jones. I'm the author of Classics Illustrated, A Cultural History. And it is my great pleasure to introduce my friend, Randy Duncan. He is the Ellis College Distinguished Professor of Communication and Director of the Center for Comic Studies at Henderson State University. He's given talks about comics in New York, Paris, Athens, Sao Paulo, Belfast, Oxford, Prague, among other places. He is the co-author of The Power of Comics, History, Form, and Culture, 2 editions, and Creating Comics as Journalism, Memoir, and Nonfiction. He's the co-editor of the Eisner Award-nominated Critical Approaches to Comics, Theories and Methods, and the companion volume, More Critical Approaches to Comics. In 1992, Randy co-founded the Comics Arts Conference, the very first US academic conference devoted to comics. In 2010, he won the Inge Award for Excellence in Comic Scholarship, and in 2012, Comic-Con International gave him an Inkpot Award for contributions to comics studies. Randy is the co-curator of the currently touring exhibition Marvel, Universe of Superheroes, and co-editor of the Routledge Advances in Comics Studies book series. And Randy, if I'm not mistaken, the touring exhibition Marvel, Universe of Superheroes is currently in Chicago. Am I correct?
It is in the building. The official opening is on March 4th at the Museum of Science and Industry. And so that's one reason I thought it would be good to talk about Marvel today.
Right. Well, let's get underway.
Okay. Well, I'm going to do that awkward screen sharing thing. It says the host has disabled participant screen sharing. But I think, Nathan, shouldn't I be able to do that as a panelist? Okay, there we go. Okay, and you've already, whoop, I don't know why that went away. I think it's just taking a while to load, maybe. I might have put too many images in.
Well, while we're waiting on the images to load, I'd like to say that one of the interesting things about this program is that it addresses one of the great pop cultural events of the last half century, really. The beginning with the 1962-63 advent of the Marvel Universe, and here we are with it.
Okay, if I can get the slides to advance. Okay, so as I said, this is going to open this week in Chicago, Museum of Science and Industry, and so that's kind of a context for why I thought it was a good idea to talk about Marvel. And let's start a little bit before the beginning of the Marvel Universe with Moses Goodman, who went by Mo, but changed that to Martin. So Bill, can you give me a check that this is showing up okay?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay.
In all the black and white glory. Here we are.
So Martin Goodman began publishing pulp magazines, which have stories in them that are illustrated now and then. They're not comic books, but prose stories, and published many titles, but I want you to kind of notice these two titles, Khazar and Marvel Science Stories, because like many pulp publishers, he got into comic book publishing. And he started in 1939 by borrowing a name from one of those pulp magazines, Marvel. And depending on what device you're watching on, if you can look down to the bottom left, you'll see that it features a Khazar story. So he's borrowing right away from his pulp content to create the first comic book in the company that would become eventually, in a couple of decades, Marvel Comics. Now, in that Marvel exhibition, when you enter, you go down a red carpet, and at the end of that red carpet, there's an actual copy of a 1939 Marvel Comics. I don't know the particular value of this one, but a comic like this sold for over $1 million. So you can imagine that if you go to this exhibit, you should not touch that case, because alarms will go off, guards will throw you to the ground. Now, the company, as I said, wasn't called Marvel yet. It was Timely Comics. And I think it will help us illustrate the first lesson from the Marvel Universe, that family is important. So in 1939, the country's been in a decade of depression. And if you are someone who has a company and can employ family members, then it's something you should do. And so Timely Comics was a family business. Martin Goodman's wife, Jean, was the co-owner and an editor. He hired 4 of his brothers. Abraham was the office manager, Arthur, David, and Sidney as editors. And he did that stereotype of giving your brother-in-law a job. He even hired 2 of his wife's teenage cousins, Stanley Lieber and Lawrence Lieber. And we'll come back to the Lieber brothers in a little bit. But in the Marvel stories themselves, family is always an important aspect. So Peter Parker, his parents have died when he was young. He's raised by his loving Aunt May and Uncle Ben. After he gets his spider powers and creates his Spider-Man identity that he tries to use to make money, he realizes that a criminal that he let pass that he could have stopped ended up killing his Uncle Ben. And so the guilt he feels for that is what really impels him to use his abilities and his new identity, not just for his own profit, but to help others. And Peter Parker spends a good bit of his time worrying about his frail Aunt May and her health, and how to get money to pay for her doctor bills and her medicine. Now, of course, in the movies, Aunt May has become less and less frail in subsequent movies. But the family theme in Marvel Comics is strongest in the Fantastic Four, which in 1961 is the comic book that kicked off the modern Marvel age of comics as we know it. Sue and Johnny Storm are brother and sister. Sue is engaged to Reed Richards. And as you can see here, pretty early in the series, they get married. They have a child. Ben Grimm, the 4th member there, is not a blood relation to anyone, but the child is named Franklin Benjamin Richards after him and knows him as Uncle Benji. So we see the Fantastic Four in situations of domestic situations, maybe kind of 1960s stereotypically domestic for Sue in her apron there and washing dishes. And Reed's being his typical self of inventing something that is far more complex than it needs to be. This is drawn by Jack Kirby, who loved to draw imaginary, very complex machinery. The Fantastic Four would also go on family vacations, although their vacations would usually be interrupted by some sort of menace that they had to deal with. And over the years, the family continued to grow. So Reed and Sue had another child, a daughter. Ben married his longtime girlfriend, Alicia. They adopted 2 children from other planets. Johnny, who's had many girlfriends over the years in the current Fantastic Four comic book, seems to have met his soulmate. And so we get lots of family images like this that are very important to the Fantastic Four comic book. But Comic books are soap operas also because they come out every month, and so you've got to shake things up. So it's not always bliss. Here's an instance where Sue and Reed split up for a time. So you get those kinds of ups and downs just to keep things interesting. Which leads us to the second lesson: family can be complicated. Probably the two most famous brothers in the Marvel Universe are Thor and Loki. And as young children, they couldn't have been more different. And throughout the decades in the comic book, of course, they clash numerous times. It's so much something that is a part of the Marvel Universe that you can actually, if you have $150 to spend, buy these little statues of them recreating a clash from the comics. And it was Loki who brought the Avengers together in the first issue of the Avengers, and of course the same in the movie. Now, there are lots of sibling rivalries in the Marvel Universe, and we don't have time to talk about all of them, but they are often a key aspect that the plot revolves around, especially in the Inhumans between Maximus and Black Bolt. But let's talk about some real world brothers. So remember those Lieber brothers that I talked about? Well, Stanley became known as Stan Lee, and his younger brother, Larry Lieber, pretty much lived his professional career in the shadow of his older brother. And that's kind of a shame because I imagine most of you knew the name Stan Lee, but maybe not everyone knew Larry Lieber, even though he was fairly important in the early days of Marvel. So he wrote the first 9 scripts for the Ant-Man stories, first 9 Ant-Man stories, first 8 Thor stories, and the very first Iron Man story that introduced the character. But if you can read those little credit boxes, you'll notice that his older brother's name is above his, because Stan Lee provided the basic idea and the plot, even though the actual script was Larry's work. Larry Lieber also worked for more than 3 decades drawing Amazing Spider-Man newspaper strip Stan Lee wrote. And there were times, like in this example, where the newspaper syndicate seemed to want to give the credit to Stan Lee because that was a name that people knew. But most of the time, Larry did get his credit. So as you see here, but still, he's second fiddle to Stan. And by this time, Larry was pretty much doing the plots, and Stan would just come in and put in dialogue, not even necessarily have been involved in creating the storyline. Larry was doing all of that himself. So a little bit of sibling rivalry there. But let's go back to that young kid, Stanley Lieber, and look into how he became this face of Marvel and then this icon that's pretty much known worldwide. And so that'll relate to our third lesson: become who you are. Now, Larry Lieber, when he was hired at Timely Comics, was a teenager. He was filling up inkwells, sharpening pencils, going and getting lunch for people. But he had, even from a younger age, had an aspiration to be a writer. And so he got a chance to write some text pieces for the Captain America comic book. Now, in those days, comic books needed to have so many pages of text in order to qualify for a lower postal rate. And the publishers felt like no one's going to read these, no one cares about them, so we don't care who writes them or how well they're written. But Stanley intended to be a great novelist someday, and he didn't want to use his actual name and have it tarnished by being in a lowly comic book. So he broke his first name into 2 pieces, Stan Lee, and created that pen name that then he eventually legally changed his name to. Because at the Timely offices where he worked, everything was pretty much run by the art director, Joe Simon, or the editorial director, Joe Simon, and the art director, Jack Kirby. But when they were fired in late 1941, 19-year-old Stan Lee, the office errand boy, suddenly was the editorial director in charge of Timely Comics. So that put him on a path that wasn't necessarily the path to a great novelist that he had expected. I don't want to take too much time on this, but I think this is interesting. This Christmas card that Timely staff did for him in the late 40s, when he was still, in his 20s at that time, and they must have thought he was a bit of a taskmaster. You can see the whip and the mace down there, and that maybe he could be a little harsh when people didn't do things correctly. Notice the bloody axe and the arm. He seemed to have a high opinion of himself. You notice the sign to the right of the door that says knock, wait, bow, speak, bow, and leave. I think one of the most telling things is the heart with the arrow through it that says SL plus SL, that seems to indicate that who Stan Lee loved most was Stan Lee. However, even though that seems like a harsh judgment on the boss, he also had a sense of humor about himself, because they felt like they could give him this card and they could sign it. And so that shows a little bit of probably the struggles maybe he had as a young person trying to shoulder that responsibility. Here's one from the 1950s, when the company was known as Atlas during that era. And again, he's cracking the whip. The company had some financial troubles during that time and maybe didn't always pay on time. So you can see the pay vouchers kind of falling out of the sack there, which indicating that maybe some people weren't getting paid like they should have been. But when in the 1960s, the heroes that we know today were introduced, and the Marvel age of comics, as we call it, was underway. Stan Lee was definitely involved in that. Maybe he gets more credit than he deserves for it because he was co-creating these characters with people. Captain America had actually been created in 1941 by Simon and Kirby before they left the company. But the success of those characters then led to Stan Lee becoming the face of Marvel Comics, because he was still the editor-in-chief. He was invited to speak on college campuses. He was profiled in magazines and newspaper articles, and he kind of became the face of mainstream comics. And of course, nowadays, new generations know him as that old guy who's in cameos in movies. So from the office errand boy to the best known comics icon in the world, he sort of became who he was. He probably wasn't a great writer. He wasn't going to be a great novelist, but he's been a pretty good icon. So let's see how this worked out with some of the characters. So when Peter first gets his powers, he thinks he can make money as a wrestler. And over on the right from the comic, he's at that wrestling arena where they haven't wanted to pay him what they had promised they would. And he doesn't stop that thief that runs by, tells the cop, that's your problem. Yeah, I'm not letting anyone, I'm looking out for number one now. But of course, we know that that's the person who kills his Uncle Ben. And then that leads to him to the realization that with great power, there must also come great responsibility, which is probably the most quoted line from any Marvel comic, and probably a caption that Stan Lee did write himself. Now we know that Tony Stark went from being a self-centered arms dealer, egotistical, self-centered arms dealer, to being a egotistical, somewhat less self-centered hero. And then I don't want to run any movies for anybody, but then made the ultimate sacrifice in order to save everyone. One of the most interesting journeys of this type in the Marvel Comics is Stephen Strange, who's a very successful surgeon, one of the best in the world, and is very, as it said, very proud and haughty about his success. Well, he has an automobile accident in which the nerves in his hands are damaged, and he can no longer operate. And some of his colleagues, are saying, well, you can work as my consultant, but he's too proud for that. He says he's got to be the best or nothing on it. So he is this kind of a jerk who then becomes bitter when his life is shattered. But he undergoes a journey from which he eventually emerges as the sorcerer supreme of our dimension, who's selflessly protecting all of us from those things that we don't even know exist. So before we get to the next lesson, here's a quote you might have heard in various ways. Immature artists imitate and mature artists steal. And it's been attributed to lots of creative people who've said slightly different versions of it. Now, T.S. Eliot, when he said his version, went on to specify that when you steal, if you're a good poet, you're going to make it better than the original, or at least make it something different. And so the history of Marvel Comics through Timely era and Atlas era and into the Marvel age show us that you should steal from good sources and then make it your own. Now, sometimes Marvel was doing that first thing. They were just imitating. They were being the poor or immature artists, because Homer Hooper is pretty much absolutely just Archie Andrews. And Homer the Happy Ghost is absolutely just Casper the Friendly Ghost. And so they weren't making that their own or improving on it. But sometimes in Marvel history, they've kind of stolen things from themselves. So the Vision, created by Simon and Kirby back in 40 or 41, was a being from another dimension. And so Roy Thomas, who loves comics history and has an encyclopedic knowledge of Golden Age characters, did lots of revivals for both Marvel and DC. But for this one, he wanted to have that same look when the Vision was introduced on the cover as that original character, even though this Vision, being an android or synthesoid or whatever you want to call him, is a totally different character. Now, even Captain America himself was a copy of another patriotic hero, or at least inspired by a patriotic hero. So the Shield came before Captain America, and Martin Goodman felt like he wanted that same sort of character. Stories differ whether it was first Joe Simon's idea or Martin Goodman's idea. But Captain America obviously became his own character and something different than any of the other patriotic characters, because throughout the course of the publication of Captain America in various comics, he changes as our culture changes. So in 1968, a lot of people are recognizing a lot of the injustices in the world, and people are protesting against some of those. And as Cap is thinking here, as he's roaming the streets of New York, I spent a lifetime defending the flag and the law. Perhaps I should have battled less and questioned more. So he's kind of a changing reflection of our culture. He's a character in his own right, but he's also a metaphor. Now, DC Comics started to revive superheroes in the 50s. We don't have time to go into why they'd sort of disappeared. But when that came out, Martin Goodman was thinking, we need to do superheroes again. And so Stan Lee and Jack Kirby created the Fantastic Four. And you can see the cover is even kind of similar, heroes fighting some giant creature. But from the beginning, the Fantastic Four was very different in tone, very different in the nature of these heroes, who really weren't so much a superhero team as a family of adventurers, and they didn't have secret identities. And during the run, like I think it was 102 issues that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby did on Fantastic Four, introduced so many of the concepts that are now parts of the movies. It's where Black Panther first appeared, for example, where the Inhumans first appeared. And it above the title, for a while there, it said the world's greatest comic magazine. And I think, you can argue maybe from about issue 35 to about issue 85, maybe it really was. So it became better than what it was copying. The Hulk was obviously inspired by Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the meek, mild person that transforms into this monster. I think there's also a little bit of Frankenstein's monster in there, and you can see from some of that blown up artwork there on the right that how he was drawn looked like depictions of Frankenstein oftentimes, and the Boris Karloff makeup. This is from the exhibition that's going to be in Chicago, and by the way, that Hulk in the background is like 10 feet tall. I know he looks small there. It's a favorite photo op for people. The 1931 Frankenstein movie had that moment where Frankenstein, meets the little girl out in the woods and she's giving him flowers. Well, in the Marvel exhibition, there's some stealing from that, in that artist Steve Rude did an original painting that only appears in that exhibition of a quiet moment that the Hulk has within nature that's obviously inspired by the 1931 Frankenstein film. So our fifth lesson is that heroes don't give up. And one of the classic examples of that comes early in the Marvel age of heroes, when Daredevil is very much outmatched by the much more powerful Prince Namor of Atlantis, who is having one of his occasional rampages against the surface world. And Daredevil is trying to stop him, but he's losing the fight, and he's exhausted, and he can't move. But Namor is so impressed by his perseverance that he goes back to Atlantis and quits tearing things up in the surface world. One of the favorite moments from Spider-Man comics for Spider-Man fans is Spider-Man 33. Aunt May is dying, as she does often in the early days of Spider-Man. And if she doesn't get this serum he's found, she's going to die. But he, in a fight with Doc Ock, part of a building collapses. This huge metal piece of machinery falls on him and traps him. And if he can't get out of that, his Aunt May is going to die. So, even for a guy who's superpowered, it's a superhuman effort, and he finally succeeds. And this is one of the most reprinted sequences from Spider-Man. And so therefore, it's no surprise that in the movie, the Spider-Man Homecoming, they kind of recreate that moment for Spider-Man. Aunt May's life is not on the line in this one because she's young, healthy Marissa Tomei in that movie. But in Avengers Endgame, there's a point where the Avengers are fighting Thanos and all of his forces, and most of them are unconscious or not able to move, and Captain America struggles to his feet, kind of stumbles forward, and faces the overwhelming odds of Thanos and his army. Now, that must have been about how the company known as Marvel Comics felt in the mid-1990s. Because newspapers all over the world declared that, it was known as Marvel Entertainment Group, the parent company, was filing for bankruptcy protection. So there'd been some changes in the market, some speculator boom and bust. The company had made some really poor business decisions, and they were struggling. And so one of the things that they did, desperate for money, they did this before the bankruptcy and some after, they sold their valuables. And their valuables were their intellectual properties, the rights to the characters. And specifically, they were selling the rights to make movies with those characters. So 20th Century Fox got the rights to the characters of the X-Men universe and the Fantastic Four, and Sony got Spider-Man. There's a little bit more complicated history on that of people who originally had rights and subleased them and all, but essentially those movie studios could make some movies with those characters. But before they did that, New Line Cinema had licensed some of Marvel's minor characters. And in 1998, the Blade movie was released, and it made $70 million, which surprised the heck out of everybody. And Marvel made $25,000 out of that. So that shows you how they were kind of, over a barrel, as they say. They were a disadvantage in the negotiations, and these studios got extremely favorable deals. And they got to keep this license almost indefinitely, as long as they made movies every once in a while, and they didn't have to share very much of the profit with Marvel. So Marvel realized we needed the money up front, so we made bad deals, which aren't benefiting us. So they had the bold idea. This is where they're Captain America getting up off the ground and staggering forward. Why don't we create our own movie studio? And in order to do that, they had to borrow some money. And it wasn't a whole lot in terms of corporations, but the only thing they had to put up for collateral for this $525 million was the remaining characters that they had not licensed the rights to. And the way that the deal was structured, the loan was structured, if they could not repay the loan in a timely manner, they lost the rights to these characters. So it was kind of a do or die. You know, it was going to be the end of Marvel. But New Line Cinema had licensed another character, minor character that no one had ever heard of. And so they thought, and he wasn't on this list that they had to use the money for. So they thought, well, let's start Marvel Studios, and we're going to announce that we're going to make a movie with this minor character that most of the world is going to go, who now? You know, I've heard of Spider-Man, I've heard of the Hulk, but why the heck are you making an Iron Man movie? Well, they made one, and it made $500 million. And so that put them on the path. And as the saying goes, the rest was history. And the history is still being written. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is movies and broadcast television shows and streaming shows and some stories in comics and some narratives that even work into games. It's the largest transmedia storytelling that's ever been undertaken. It's all fits together and is consistent. And so it's this vast, ambitious thing that has kind of wowed the entertainment world. And it came from this company that was very, very, very close to being dead and gone. Now, I mentioned Stan Lee a number of times during this, partly because I figure most people tuning in have heard of Stan Lee. But Marvel Comics, which formed the basis for this vast MCU universe of stories, would not have been what it is if not for people like Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, Larry Lieber, some I haven't mentioned, such as John Romita, Roy Thomas, I mentioned briefly, Marie Severin, Gene Colan, Jim Starlin. I could have made these headshots a lot smaller and put a lot more people on there because there are hundreds of people that contributed to the success of Marvel Comics. And I think sometimes it gets overshadowed because Stan Lee was so good at becoming an icon and becoming the face of the company. But the company was a lot of talented people over the years that kind of loved what they did and put their heart and souls into it and created some great stories that Marvel Studios is wisely drawing from pretty directly. You know, so they're stealing from themselves, from their comics end, and making some updates and improvements. So still teaching us that lesson of steal from good sources and make it your own. And so that kind of wraps up the formal presentation part of this. But if we have just a few moments before we get to Q&A, looks like I didn't ramble as long as I thought I would. I might just show you a few more images from that exhibition, because this is the closest it's going to get to Arkansas. And after one more stop in the US, it goes overseas. So if you think you might like to see it, this summer, if things are safer, might be the time. It opens March 4th and then runs till September is the current plan. So in addition to these, like you saw the Hulk statue and the Black Panther one, there's original art, like you can see in the background there, blown up art from comics and interactive media tables where you get to do, to learn by doing in some cases. One of my favorite rooms is the Doctor Strange room. And as you see here, it has a lot of costumes and props from the movie. But it's this mirrored environment that constantly keeps changing. And depending on where you stand, you see different things in it. It's kind of trippy. And that's imitating Steve Ditko's artwork when he was showing these other dimensions that Dr. Strange would go into. And if you don't ever get to the exhibit, I'm pretty sure that Central Arkansas Library System now has at least one copy somewhere of the exhibition catalog, which is just titled Marvel Universe of Superheroes. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing at this point and see how that works. Okay. That was
there are some questions from audience members.
Okay.
One early one was with regard to Jack Kirby. Do you know anything about him having served at Camp Robinson at any time?
I don't know about that. I know that he was in the military, and he was overseas, and he was in the fighting, and as opposed to some of the other folks in comics who got to serve stateside. I do know that Stan Lee, and I'm not sure where he was stationed, but he wrote informational things and made little informational films about how not to get gonorrhea and whatnot. And in his free time, continued to write some of the timely comics, whereas Jack was in a foxhole with a rifle and not getting to draw anything. But I'm not sure where he was stationed stateside now.
Well, keeping with Jack Kirby, and this is one of those things that can balloon into an all-consuming conversation. So keeping in mind that we have other questions, there's a question about addressing the relationship, famously fraught relationship between Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. It's been thrust into the public eye again with the new book, True Believer.
Yes.
Do you have an opinion on which is the better biography, True Believer or Danny Fingeroth's Marvelous Life?
I think you should take the average of those two. Danny Fingeroth, who was a Marvel editor, he was the Spider-Man group editor, also a consultant on the Marvel exhibition, by the way, admires Stan Lee. He admits that, and he knew him a little bit personally, and so maybe his is a little bit too easy on Stan at times. But I think sometimes there's people who emotionally side so much with Jack Kirby, maybe they're a little bit too hard on Stan Lee at times. It's unfortunate about the Lee and Kirby relationship, because I think there were periods where it was much better than Jack Kirby depicted it later in life when he got bitter about things. He was treated poorly by the company changed hands after Goodman sold it, and new owners saw Stan Lee as an asset. So they went, because he had been out there, and people knew his name, and he'd been in newspapers and magazines, and they saw everybody else as just a cog that was replaceable. And that was not Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby was so much responsible for what had made Marvel Comics successful. That he had a reason to be bitter, and he felt that Stan did not fight for him as much. But Stan Lee was something of a company man. I mean, that's partly, I think, because you come out of the Depression era, you're like, it's with you the rest of your life. You're happy to have a job. But also remember, he started in a family business, and so Martin Goodman was family, and so he just, by the time these worse things happened to Jack, he had just a habit of kind of siding with the company, even after Martin Goodman was gone, I think. As far as their contributions that they made, rather than get too long-winded, I'll direct you to, you should be able to find this in libraries, Icons of the American Comic Book. And there is an essay in there about Stan Lee. So it's a 2-volume set that I co-edited, by the way, that I'm pitching my own book here, that covers 100 different iconic aspects of comics. And obviously Stan Lee is going to be one of those. And in full disclosure, I wrote the Stan Lee essay. So all the things that I would say if I didn't just shut up right now, you can probably find in that essay, in it, as particularly as I kind of address some of the contributions they made. I don't know if that satisfied the person who asked that question or not, but.
Well, in one of the things that has always struck me about Marvel in its history is that long before DC became famous for darkening the character of Batman, for instance, the characters who inhabited the comic book Marvel universe had, as I believe Stan Lee said, feet of clay. They were very human, and they grew as characters. And I think you brought that out in your display of some of those sequences. They also have lived in the real world, whereas DC was centered on Gotham City. Say in the Marvel universe, it's New York City. And then real events impinge on that universe. There is a question from an audience member related to that, and that is, what do you think was the driving force behind Marvel's movement toward considering, say, the civil rights movement? This person has asked also, I'm thinking of how the X-Men are representative of how society treats people who are different. Nathan, could you address that, please? Nathan?
I don't know if Nathan's there too.
All right.
Well, you want me to answer that question about?
Yes, go ahead. Nathan had indicated he wanted to do that, but he's not available. So. Okay.
Oh, he texted me. Yeah, Nathan. I think he was asking if if you wanted to answer that question. Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and. So the real world aspect impinging in it, one of the, I had a much longer presentation than when I looked at it, I realized, okay, that's the 90 minutes. So I cut out, for example, a section that was showing the Black Panther actually fighting the Klan. And they didn't call them the Sons of the Serpent, which was another racist organization in the Marvel Universe. It was the actual Klan. Yeah. I think a lot of these things come from the fact of there was a new generation of comics creators who had grown up as fans, like Roy Thomas, for example, but like Denny O'Neil and Mike Friedrich, you know, and people, Marv Wolfman, people who were more in touch with the youth movement because they were young, and they were concerned about those things, and other young people were in the streets protesting, and they brought a lot of that perspective to it. Now, I think some of it was Stan Lee because he desperately wanted to be hip. You know, from the toupee he started wearing and the sunglasses and everything. He eventually got hair plugs, but he actually had a pilot. I don't know if you've ever seen this, for a talk show that was going to be Stan Lee talks to young activists on campus. And I think it was mostly going to be people who were involved in campus journalism. They were going to talk about the issues of the day. But that didn't go well because I think he genuinely cared about things, but it was also part of a persona he was trying to create. And the kids weren't buying it. And that kind of came across in the pilot that was filmed, that you know, he was in his 40s when, 42 or something, when they created Fantastic Four. So he was, you know, 50ish or so by the time he's trying to do this thing. But I think that those are the people who brought more of the real world concerns in, is that younger wave of creators.
Related to this is a question from an attendee who asks, do you believe that the early family themes within Marvel, with characters such as Peter Parker and the Fantastic Four, still resonate today with the expansion of the Marvel brand to focusing on non-white and LGBTQ heroes and their families?
I do. I mean, I think that if anyone's read this Marvel book, it's very evocative of the late 1960s Spider-Man stories, because she's a teenager. She's a Muslim teenager, and so her parents have different traditions and concerns, but she still gets exasperated by those, just the way a teenager would. She still exasperates them with her behavior, and it's kind of adding new layers of when someone who's not in the dominant strata of society is trying to navigate different layers in it. So I think in particular, some of the characters like Riri Williams, who's Ironheart, young African-American superhero, with a single mom, and kind of worried about some of the problems in her city, and some of the urban problems that superheroes usually just fly over on their way to the supervillain. I think that Marvel's done a pretty good job, and they made a conscious effort over the last 10 years to be more diverse, more contemporary, and acknowledging kind of the world the way it is today.
Going back to T.S. Eliot's comment, what is your favorite thing that Marvel stole and made better, and what might they have stolen and made worse?
Oh, okay. Well, I put the Vision in there because I've always liked the way they used the look of the original, but that is so different that that I don't know if you can say that it's the same thing made better or not. But something that they had made worse than the original. When we talk about relevance in comics, we have to give credit to DC, and particularly to Denny O'Neil, who was one of those young Turks that came along, and the series Green Lantern, Green Arrow, where, as improbable as this sounds to anyone who's not read it, Green Lantern, who's a space policeman, and Green Arrow, who's more a street level hero, are frenemies, because they decided that the company decided we're going to make Green Arrow very left wing and Green Lantern very right wing, and then they're going to get together with this little short blue guy from another planet. They're going to get in a pickup truck and they're going to drive across America. In every issue, they're going to deal with some of the current problems in the world: racism, pollution, overcrowding, poverty, and they're going to punch some people along the way because it's a superhero comic book. And so it's not perfect, but I think that DC was doing that better than Marvel was, and then some of Marvel's first attempts at that were a little bit clumsy in it. And I think that may be Stan Lee, as progressive as he liked to think of himself as, also thought like a company man and went, let's not upset too many people. So there's a Spider-Man cover with Spider-Man kind of swinging over a bunch of students protesting, and it says on the cover, "Crisis on Campus." Well, that's really just sort of background stuff, and Spider-Man kind of in his thought balloons is understanding what the students are protesting about, but then like saying, but I also see the university's point of view on this, because I think they're going to occupy the dean's office to demand something in that. So Marvel could be a little lukewarm at first when they were trying to make their comics relevant, and they didn't take strong stands on things necessarily.
What do you think the future holds with just in the corporate sense, the way this thing has expanded beyond anyone's imagination in the 1940s?
I mean, someone who's a comic book fan and loves the comic books, it seems like the tail wagging the dog, and that comics now are maybe driven by what movies do, but it's not a good metaphor, because that's one heck of a big tail and a little bitty dog. But I think that for comics in general, success with X-Men movies and the other movies has made everyone think of comic books as IPs, as intellectual properties that can be licensed for money in movies. And so I don't think that little pamphlets are going to go away, or as I read them now on my iPad, the little digital comics are going to go away. Because there's still people that kind of love that form. It's a different art form than movies. But it's certainly overshadowed now by the movies. And I think that people have been saying for a couple of years we're going to reach a saturation point with superhero movies, but I don't know that we're there yet. And Marvel has more than 800 characters. So you may think you've seen them all in movies, but you haven't yet. And they keep finding kind of inventive things to do. I've been watching WandaVision on Disney Plus, and it's very different than anything they've done before. And it's obviously kind of a bridge to lead us into some new characters that are going to be introduced. And I think maybe a bridge into the Doctor Strange movie that's coming up. So Kevin Feige, now he's not the only one involved, but he seems to be the master planner. But he and the people he worked with are just so great at taking what's best in the comics to use for the movies, and then kind of slowly rolling out this connected universe, and I don't know that we're going to get tired of it within the next 10 years or not. So that's what I think the immediate future is like. The comics weathered television, which it seemed like that was going to put them out of business, because the other time that the company almost went under was in the late 1950s, when all the genres that kids loved in comics, they could now get for free on television. And comics survived.
And the anti-comics crusade of the 50s as well. Yeah. And it's just extraordinary to me to think about the origins of various comics publishers, Goodman family, the Cantor family with Classics Illustrated. They were all family enterprises, and now they are just these global behemoths. Does that affect the integrity ultimately of the product?
Yes, of course it does. I mean, the only comic books that we can say there's absolute integrity for are those that are self-published by someone who writes and draws and letters, and the vision that their talent allowed them to produce. Because when we get to mainstream comics, as opposed to independent or alternative comics, it's now all very corporate, and it keeps changing. So now DC is under Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers is under AT&T, and it's kind of like a bigger fish keeps coming along and eating the previous fish. I don't know where you find the bigger fish that eats Disney, though. That's going to be difficult. but yeah, when you have layers of masters, there's that story that Paul Levitz used to tell. Well, I'm not sure if he's the one that told me this, but somebody told me about how he became president because Jeanette Kahn was fired because some executive at Warner found out that Superman was dead. He let that happen. But we know in comics, death is temporary. But he's like, oh, but we licensed so much Superman stuff. That was so stupid. Get rid of her. I don't know that happened, but I think that's maybe an apocryphal story that's an illustration of how corporate thinking can affect things. And actually, Paul Levitz lost his job partly because Disney bought Marvel, and they wanted a person who cared about movies more than they cared about comics in his job, and he was too much of a comics guy. He's got kind of the same Stan Lee origin. Started when he was 17 at DC, worked his way up to editor and publisher.
Those days are gone.
Yeah.
There's a question from an audience member about the Center for Comic Studies, and how is it coming along? And is there anything that people who are interested in supporting the Center for Comic Studies at Henderson State can do?
Okay. Well, it came about in 2019, and people who follow news in Arkansas know that Henderson State University had some financial problems, and then COVID came along. So a lot of our plans hadn't materialized, but one thing we're working on now is an oral history project that will go on for years, an oral history of comics fandom in Arkansas. So if there's anyone who's a native Arkansan and a comics fan, we would like to have them, if they can, come to the Henderson campus, or we can come to you. And some of these are just going to be audio recordings, but we'd like to get a few people on film, because we're also talking about doing a short documentary about that. And so the idea is to kind of knowledge makes it a cultural product, a part of our culture in Arkansas, because it's amazing how many people we have at Arkansas who have done things related to comics, such as William B. Jones Jr., who's perhaps the world's leading expert on Classics Illustrated. Michael Tierney, who owns a comic book shop in Little Rock, owns one still in North Little Rock, who might be one of the world's leading experts on Edgar Rice Burroughs, and particularly Tarzan. And Haynes Ware, who's passed, who was one of the detectives that tracked down who did artwork back in the days when credits were not given, and a guy who's instrumental in getting me interested in comics in a scholarly way, Michael Barrier. His Smithsonian comic book I read when I was young, and introduced me to that I didn't know existed, and all those people just right there in Central Arkansas, and others that I'm forgetting about, and down here at Henderson, Travis Langley, who's put out a series of books, not all about comics, but looking at various popular culture and explaining psychology through those. But and he's put together so many panels at conventions around the country. And I think he knows every psychologist, psychiatrist, and counselor who has an interest in comics. And is through doing those panels and then contributing to his books, there's this synergy that's developed that we're seeing around the country, more people using comics in therapy, for example. And so just a lot of interesting people in, also people who've created comics in Arkansas. But I'd also like to have mixed in with all those people someone who hadn't done those things, but just loves comics and has read a lot of them and wants to talk about that experience. Because I think that buying comics in a rural state can be a very different experience of like when you're in Chicago or New York City and you've got so many places to choose from to buy them. So anyway, I got a little too enthusiastic about that and carried away, but that's a current project. There's a couple of exhibits that are probably going to happen down the line. I don't want to mention where because they're in the formative stages, but exhibits of comic art, and one of them might be specifically the comics created by Arkansans. So that'd be an art exhibit that probably a couple of years at least down the line, because those things take time to put together. But
that's fantastic.
And also, you can donate money to the foundation, to the Center for Comic Studies with HSU Foundation. Yeah, anyone out there who wants to support that way.
And I really hope people who are attending this will keep in mind that Comics Fandom Project that just has immense historic value.
Yeah.
It looks
like
I
was last year going to Comic-Cons and interviewing people, but of course, that didn't work out.
It appears we're at 7:32. Nathan, do you need to wrap things up for us? Well, I guess.
Okay, he says maybe one more question.
Okay. Let's see. I don't see any. Let me check again because more may have arrived.
Well, Bill, is there anything you wanted to add? Because I'm sure there's.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, there are some really great ones. Have any women writers emerged as primary writers for Marvel back in the 40s? You know, there were very few women writers. Classics Illustrated had one of the most outstanding with the Iger shop. But what about Marvel?
Yeah, I can't think of her name right now. There was a husband and wife who both worked for Marvel, and she did some writing. Contemporary, there are lots of female writers who are doing interesting work. The one that's probably best known for her contributions to Marvel is Kelly Sue DeConnick. And she kind of, in some ways, led the way for the idea of, on a female character, it'd be nice to have a female writer, because we had so many decades of them not having that. And so her run on Captain Marvel character, the female Captain Marvel, there have been so many Captain Marvels in comics history overall, but the Carol Danvers one that appears in the movie. That movie would not have happened, I don't think, if Kelly Sue DeConnick had not written Captain Marvel. I think that character would have been farther down on the list of characters to make movies from, and it's very much inspired by her work.
Well, here is an extension of that question that involves women artists, and that was, of course, an anomaly back in the 40s. Lillian Chestney was working, and but Marie Severin.
Yes. Yeah.
But are there any other contemporary women artists working in the Marvel universe?
What was that last part of the question? I'm sorry.
Are there any other women artists working in the Marvel universe?
Yes. A lot of Sari Pacelli is one that does a lot of work, and Fiona Staples has done some work for Marvel. I'm terrible about keeping up with the names of current people. I read a lot of current comics still. I don't read as many Marvel comics now as I did 6 or 7 years ago when I was first working on planning that Marvel exhibition. But when I was working on that, Matt Smith, who's a co-author and co-editor with me on lots of projects, is also a co-curator on that. And he was like, Randy, you're really great on things until we get to about 1987. And Matt's 10 years younger than I am, so I'm like, well, yeah, I think you'll know all that stuff.
There's an interesting.
She's passed now, but she was kind of, the life of the bullpen. The bullpen was kind of a mythical thing, and a lot of people even then were working freelance, but there were people in the office, and because she did some production work and some inking and things, and she made it a fun place to work, I think, and so she was someone that I think could calm Stan down sometimes when he got on a rampage about something too.
Here's an interesting one. What are the 10 Marvel storylines, graphic novels that all fans should read? What are the essentials?
My goodness. Okay. We start with, and these aren't necessarily graphic novels, but we start with a Fantastic Four run during which Inhumans and Galactus and Black Panther and all are introduced. And we get so much of the Marvel universe, and Jack and Stan were getting along pretty well in those days, and they were clicking. And even though, Jack was really doing most of the writing, at the time he liked Stan's dialogue. Okay, it was years later that he went, hey, ruined it by putting all that stuff in. So that's one place to start. More contemporary is Ultimate Spider-Man that Brian Michael Bendis wrote. I think in some ways it's more relatable than the older Spider-Man, which can seem a little dated sometimes, even though I love the original. But Miles Morales is just an interesting character. And if you saw Into the Spider-Verse, you know that. And if you haven't seen Into the Spider-Verse, you need to do that. One of the first graphic novels they did was called The Death of Captain Marvel, the male Captain Marvel. And Jim Starlin did that. And I'm not a fan of either Jim Starlin's artwork or writing in some respects, but yet I still like the product. So I can't explain why that is. But Jim Starlin is responsible for Thanos and for Gamora and for a lot of the cosmic aspects of the Marvel universe. And so might be other better things of his, but that's kind of an interesting one that he was doing it at an operatic level on it almost. Goodness, I mean, there's so much stuff to choose from in there. One of the things that this was a Marvel comic, but it's a licensed property. But there was a run on Conan the Barbarian that Jason Aaron wrote, and it was just really kind of a collection of short stories that were all sort of related to this overall theme, and they were just all great in that. And actually, I like the old Roy Thomas, John Buscema era of Conan the Barbarian. That's kind of the era that Barack Obama was a fan of. If you ever heard him talk about comics, Conan the Barbarian was his favorite of those comics.
Well, you can't do much better than Roy.
No.
Storyteller. There is another question here that relates to the exhibit, and I want to read the full question so I can do justice to it. While certainly Lee and the Pantheon deserve the credit for everything they built, to what degree does the exhibit interrogate or even evaluate the continuance of that legacy by luminaries like Brian Michael Bendis or Jonathan Hickman?
Okay. I can't swear we've got a Jonathan Hickman item at the moment. There's more than 300 items, and they change sometimes from venue to venue. So this has been it premiered in Seattle, was in Philadelphia, was in Edmonton, was in the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. And I don't think anyone got to see it because I think Michigan was closed down during the time it was there. But the lenders for this want their babies back. So the original artwork is often traded out. As far as I know, we're going to get to keep that Marvel Comics #1, which is the insurance costs on that exhibit have got to be sky high for that. For example, the Smithsonian loaned us original pages of artwork from Amazing Fantasy 15, the first appearance of Spider-Man. Not all of them, but 3 pages from that. But then they wanted those back after one show. So we do have Bill Sienkiewicz work that we do have hybrid work. We do have, and some artists actually have done original things. Like I said, Steve Rude, who's not really known as a Marvel artist, did that painting of Hulk for us. There's a wonderful Gene Colan pencil piece that I hope is still there. It's just his pencils on a Captain America fighting Nazis, but it's beautiful. I like Gene Colan's fluid artwork. So yeah, we get up to very contemporary or acknowledged, but who we can acknowledge kind of depends on what items we have at that time. That's constantly rotating because there's a lending agreement that says you can have this for so many months. And, you know, COVID set our schedule back a little bit on it, and so some of that stuff had to be renegotiated. All that stuff, luckily, is above my pay grade, and I don't have to deal with that.
Well, we have another question here, and that is, what do you think of WandaVision, and how do you think it will flow into the MCU films?
Well, like I was saying
Before
earlier,
you start, we better make this the last one, gentlemen. So,
okay. I think there's some things that might be setting up for the Doctor Strange movie. I'm not sure, but obviously Doctor Strange is going to involve magic, and based on what we've heard about it, it's going to involve different dimensions, the multiverse. So you might get different versions of characters. We might get an explanation of how a different Pietro came to be, and why he looks like a Pietro from the X-Men franchise rather than from the Marvel movies. And I think that Wanda is going to be a character in the Doctor Strange movie from something I heard. So I think that's one of the places it's going into. It's also giving us Monica Rambeau as a superhero. She exhibited a little bit of superpowers, or a little bit of powers in one episode, and she was a Captain Marvel for a moment. What is she now? She called Quantum, or she keeps going through different names. But yeah, I think that's where we're headed on that. So I just want to make another plug that if you are a Marvel fan, I think you'll get a lot out of going to that exhibit. And if you do go, here's my plea to you: spend time on the media tables. Even though I know that other people have touched them, and that's problematic right now. But they're pretty rich in information. The times I've gone there, usually they fly me in for a grand opening thing, and it's by invitation only, and members of whatever museum get to go. I bug people by going around if they don't stay long enough at something and say, wait. There's a little Pepper's Ghost Ant-Man display, and there's just this little window there, and people go, there's a tabletop with a cup and a bowl of sugar, and I don't know what that's about. But if you wait long enough, Ant-Man runs out, and he signals come from his helmet, and he signals for ants, and they come out and put the sugar in the cup. I bug people about that, and like, use the media table.
Well, actually, I think we have reached almost all the questions.
Okay.
I'm sorry if I inadvertently skipped one from one of the attendees. Thanks, everyone, for coming, and that does it for us.
All right. I had fun. I hope other people did.
Thanks.
Thanks
Have a
to
great
Carlos for asking us to do this.